but you tend to avoid that craving and instead go for a piece of fruit. You tend to avoid bad or forbidden foods, or as some people call it, fear foods.
Welcome to the Binge Dietitian podcast. I'm Jonathan, and I'm here to help you end 24/7 food thoughts, binge eating, and actually enjoy life with food. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only, not to be substituted for medical or personalized advice.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about a big topic when it comes to binge eating. We'll talk about the main triggers to binge eating. So these are the factors that could lead you to binge eat. So this means that if you do tackle with these and avoid these triggers, then you'll most definitely have a reduction in your binge eating episodes. So here are the 3 main triggers of binge eating. Number 1, being physically hungry. So you may be thinking, how can I be hungry if I binge? If anything, I overeat so much, which is understandable to think. But if you look at the bigger picture, what does your eating pattern look like? Do you find yourself not eating regularly outside of binges? You may have had a big meal or a binge at night, for example, but once the hunger comes back, maybe the next day morning or maybe the next day afternoon, do you tend to push back that hunger because you're worried that you might gain weight or you're trying to make up for your binge last night? Dietitians who work with people who binge eat will actually focus on what you're eating outside of binges rather than what you actually binge on. Here are things to look out for, and I want you to imagine in your head your eating habits. Is there a lack of structure when it comes to your eating? Do you tend to skip meals and go hours without eating? Do you eat regularly for a few days, then stop eating the next day or two? Is there a specific time of the day when you consume the majority of your calories? Probably at night? Do you tend to eat quote-unquote healthy during the day and then find yourself binging later on? Outside of binges, do you focus on eating healthy, clean, safe, good, or boring foods, whereas your binges are quote-unquote exciting, delicious, guilty, bad, healthy, or off limits? If I was to ask you if you ate regularly, would you say yes? Some people may eat regularly for a day or two, or eat small portions, hoping it'll be enough, but then later on find themselves restricting later in the week. So, when tackling binge eating, we should look at the bigger picture. We should focus on regular eating, and regular eating means truly eating regularly and consistently during the day and during the week. So, how do we avoid this binge eating trigger of being physically hungry? So to avoid this trigger, we just have to simply eat regularly. And what this may look like is that you should eat every 3 to 4 hours. So that could look like having breakfast, mid-morning snack, then lunch, then mid-afternoon snack, dinner, and maybe an evening snack at the end of the day. Try to ensure that you're 7 or 8 out of 10 full, with 0 being ravenously hungry and 10 being painfully full. Regular eating is very protective against binge eating episodes. And as hard as it sounds, sometimes removing the trigger of physical hunger may just be enough to stop the binges altogether. What keeps most people into the binge strict cycle is that they don't want to surrender to their weight loss goals. Well, what I want you to know is that to stop binge eating, you will have to stop focusing on weight loss, at least for a while until you've stopped binge eating and it no longer has power over your life. Then, you can choose what to do with your weight when you have a much better relationship with your food. However, weight loss is not something I would suggest after binge eating recovery. So, some people might be thinking they're not losing weight or failing their diet because they're not using enough willpower. And you might be thinking, how come other people could do it and not me? I must be a failure. But what I want you to know is that you're far from it. It takes lots of courage and strength to break through binge eating. Eating regularly can be one of the simplest, yet most difficult things to do, because you'll have to surrender to your weight loss goals in order to do so. You will have to eat when you're truly hungry. This hunger may be something most people hate during diets, but in reality, it's just simply a protective mechanism by your body to warn you that we need the energy to keep our bodily functions moving. You could also be thinking, if I eat regularly, I'm definitely going to binge on all the foods I normally binge on. I'm just going to be binging regularly. So what is important next is what those regular meals and snacks should look like. The meals should be nutritionally balanced. This could be focusing on fiber, fats, carbohydrates, and protein. So if you normally have a bagel with a scrape of butter for breakfast, try to add protein and some fiber to keep you full. So this meal would transform into something like a bagel with butter and cottage cheese and chia seeds. Having a balanced meal containing fiber, fats, carbohydrates, and protein will ensure that you'll stay full. And the same goes with some snacks. So ensuring that you're eating regular, balanced meals will keep your body from being hungry, which is a trigger for binge eating, and you won't be overindulging in the foods you love. Evidence shows that people who start to eat regularly to break through their binge eating actually don't gain a significant amount of weight. So instead of building up a huge surge of hunger hormones, which is all satisfied with a big binge, you're just simply satisfying those hunger pangs by eating little and often throughout the day. You're just simply spreading those calories. But rather than focusing on weight and calories, let's look ahead into the future to what you will actually gain from being free from binge eating. You may finally enjoy meals with your loved ones without guilt. You won't have to be having this sadness lurking inside you, telling your mind that your family cooked meal is sabotaging your diet. You won't have to pretend that you're busy when friends invite you out for a delicious meal. So this leads me to the second main trigger of binge eating. Number 2, mental restriction. Mental restriction is a more subtle trigger of binge eating. Do you find yourself mentally restricting? Mental restriction looks like eating, quote-unquote, clean outside of binges. Then later on, you may get a craving for something bad, quote-unquote, like chocolate, for example. But you tend to avoid that craving and instead go for a piece of fruit. You tend to avoid bad or forbidden foods, or as some people call it, fear foods. Yes, you can replace the piece of chocolate with fruit, and you will be full, but you most likely won't be satisfied. And until you're satisfied, you might find yourself eating more and more or restricting until you start triggering the binge to satisfy that built-up unsatisfied need. Remember, satisfaction is different from being full. By the way, just a quick break from the podcast to let you know of my free hunger regulation webinar series, which is in the link in the description of this podcast. There's also an ebook version if you're more of a reader than a watcher. This is the perfect resource I wish I had when I struggled with binge eating years ago, which is used to guide you from everything you need to know, from why we binge, what are the binge triggers, and the eating pattern to stop binge eating. Because when we've been struggling with binge eating for so long, you and your body lose touch of what normal hunger and normal fullness is. You're constantly on feast or famine mode. So head to the link in the description of this podcast for the free hunger regulation resources to have a clear game plan to tackle binge eating for good. Anyway, let's get straight back to the episode. I want to ask you something. Don't think of a pink elephant. And what do you think of? A pink elephant. So if you try to hold your cravings and not honor them, you'll be thinking about them most of the day. Even if you aren't currently thinking about it, it will subconsciously be in the corner of your mind and it might pop up every now and then. And you will be thinking of this forbidden food throughout the day. So just like the trigger of physical hunger, as we said in number 1, the longer you mentally restrict, it will just simply burst open like a dam. And that's the binge. A good tip to remember is you only binge on what you restrict. So how can you stop mental restriction? You have to eat the foods you're craving. So instead of swapping to the healthier alternative, eat the foods you crave. And that could be a healthier alternative, or it could be a piece of chocolate. But make sure it's something that satisfies you. If you're craving a packet of crisps, eat that packet of crisps. If you're craving some chocolate, eat some chocolate. You might ask that this is just setting yourself up for a binge. But if you're following the regular eating pattern and not restricting physically, as we said in number 1, then you won't be so hungry and you won't find yourself overeating these foods. You'll be able to have a portion and feel satisfied. If you feel that this may be overwhelming, then you may want to remove the high-risk trigger foods. But try to avoid removing as much trigger foods as you can. So if you find that brownies are a high-risk trigger food, then you may temporarily keep those out, but keep the medium-risk trigger foods you find, such as, for example, a cereal bar. It's important to reduce as much mental restriction as possible. When we mentally restrict foods, we try to place them on a pedestal, and we start to subconsciously crave them all day. We start to see them as a massive reward. But if we're simply including them into our daily diet, then these foods will start to become neutral. They'll start to lose the sparkle of being this forbidden food. So once again, just like how to stop physical hunger, which is number 1 trigger for binge eating, to stop mental restriction, you'll have to surrender to your weight loss goals for now and put these goals to the side, at least temporarily. Finally, the third trigger of binge eating, number 3, the all or nothing mindset. So I would say that avoiding the all or nothing thinking is as equally important as avoiding physical and mental restriction. So do you ever try to eat clean for most of the week and then find yourself finally giving in to that meal you consider bad? You may give in and eat bad the whole day because you think you ruined your diet. You may think to yourself, I didn't eat perfectly. I'm just going to restart my diet again on Monday. How many times have you heard that about? Then you find yourself binging more and more. So in order to avoid the all or nothing thinking, we have to have self-compassion with ourselves. You may stop physically restricting and mentally restricting, and you may have a drastic reduction in binges. But once you do binge, you can either think to yourself, I had a binge, I'll move on from this and learn from this. Or you could think to yourself, I've failed and I cannot do this. Then you start to restrict, then binge, and restrict, then binge, placing you back into the binge restrict cycle. So, in summary, here are the 3 main triggers of binge eating: physical restriction, mental restriction, and the all or nothing thinking. And I get that. It's not your fault all of these are happening. It's simply diet culture trying to condition us that we need to restrict mentally and physically, as well as try to eat perfectly. So you shouldn't ever judge yourself whenever you think about your binge eating habits. Binge eating is mostly an issue created by diet culture, and recovery is all about reversing these unhelpful diet habits. You might have seen what I eat in a day videos online, and you might think, wow, that person must be eating so clean and perfect, but you truly never know what is going on behind the scenes. A healthy relationship with food is about eating foods you enjoy, foods that nourish you well. What is more important than eating healthy is to have a healthy relationship with food, being free from guilt. So that puts an end to this episode, and I'd like to let you all know, if you ever want to have a one-to-one session with me, a registered dietitian, we can work through your binge eating triggers and support your journey to being binge-free. So head straight to the link in my description or at bingedietician.com. And I'd just like to thank you for listening along to this episode. So thank you, and I'll see you all next time. See you guys!
Struggling with binge eating? Gain access to my exclusive self-paced binge eating freedom course found in the link in the description of this podcast. My course is everything I wish I knew when I struggled with binge eating, but it's all wrapped up into one easy to understand platform. You'll finally learn how to put an end to binge eating and put an end to food dictating everything you do, controlling your life. Access it now in the link in the description of this podcast.